really the question, what is Spring Branch, is a good question, because some people would think, well, it's a city unto itself. It's really not. There are two villages within the boundaries of Spring Branch, but it really is just part of Houston. The basic area of Spring Branch would be seen to be an area north of I-10, west of Loop 610, south of Highway 290, and east of the Beltway. That's about 150,000 people. Interestingly enough, the census would say it's about 100,000 people, but when you look at the number of apartment units, there are over 50,000 apartment units, and begin to do the math on that with occupancy rates and the number of people in each unit, there's got to be about 150,000 people here. So there's a lot of undercounting of the population here. The demographics are very interesting. They've changed dramatically since Spring Branch became a community. Today, the demographics would show you that about 70% of the population is Hispanic. They're from all over Latin America, not just Mexico, but from all over Latin America. About a 15% Asian population, the majority of which is Korean, but there's some Vietnamese, some Chinese, and the rest, a very small African American population, the rest is Anglo. But it's very reflective, I think, of the Houston community overall, probably a little bit high on the Hispanic side compared to Houston overall, but it's a tremendous amount of diversity that you'll find in Spring Branch. Yeah, where would you find diversity in Spring Branch? There are, probably the best way to explain that would be to say there's a lot of substandard housing in Spring Branch. Massive HUD subsidized apartment complexes, that's where you'll find a large concentration of Hispanics living. Post-World War II, originally what were GI homes, post-World War II, many of which are rentals. You'll find a lot of Hispanics living there. The Korean population is slowly drifting away. The Korean population, they're leaving their businesses here, they're leaving their churches here, but they, in general terms, don't want their kids in the same schools with this massive Hispanic majority, so they're moving out, and you would not find concentrations of Koreans other than their businesses in the western part of the Spring Branch area. Like I said, the African American population is pretty nominal. The Anglo population is more in the south and east of the community in the two incorporated villages and in some of the more affluent parts of the community. One of the interesting things about Spring Branch you'd find is it's just the proximity of affluence and poverty. You can find in the southern and eastern parts places where they're scraping off the old homes and building $1 million, $2 million homes on those lots, mostly white, living in there. And then 2 blocks away, there may be a massive apartment complex with thousands of people living in it. There may be street corners where the day laborers are standing waiting to be picked up, and literally they're right next to each other. And so I don't know of any other part of Houston where you would see affluence and poverty in such proximity as you would in Spring Branch. Yeah, where did Spring Branch come from? It's quite an interesting story. Spring Branch was originally settled by German immigrant farmers in the 1840s. They were mostly Lutherans, and so they started a bunch of Lutheran churches. You'll still see a lot of Lutheran churches around. In fact, the second oldest church in the city is a Lutheran church, St. Peter's on Long Point Road. There were farming activities in Spring Branch up until the 1950s. And of course, in the 1950s, there was tremendous growth. Spring Branch was a suburb. I-10 was built, and so it became a real desirable place for people to live in suburbia. And so you'll see, beginning really with the end of World War II, a lot of housing being built, some of which is still there. And so the area then became basically a white-collar suburb. And it started stretching further west out I-10 and then further north up towards Highway 290. Then in the 1980s, tremendous influx of an immigrant population, which is what we see today, which is now dominating the population of Spring Branch. You'll still see vestiges of that legacy population, that Anglo population, and they have organized into very strong homeowners associations and super neighborhoods, have a great political voice in the area, way out of proportion to their numbers. And most of those people are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Basically, they moved here when they were young, started their families here, and now they're growing old in the area. Those people have a tremendous amount of political clout through the super neighborhoods and the homeowners associations. A super neighborhood is like a homeowners association, but it has a recognition from the city. It doesn't particularly have any powers that a homeowners association doesn't have, but it has a recognition, and typically the leadership of the super neighborhoods have the ear of the city council representative, probably more so than the homeowners associations do, but essentially it's the same thing. There are a lot of challenges here. I guess most of the challenges relating to poverty. Let me just explain some of the complexion of the community. With a population of 150,000 plus, you would, in a large Hispanic majority, you would expect to find quite a few strong churches in the area, but you don't. There are a few strong churches in the area, but in our time with New Spring, we've seen churches close, we've seen churches move, churches very much struggling to survive, really. And so the types of services you would expect from the church community just don't happen here. The schools have stepped into that, and the schools have done a marvelous job stepping into it. The school district's very interesting because it's bifurcated by I-10. And so the part of the district, about a third of it south of I-10 is very affluent, very white. The part north of I-10 is very Hispanic, and it's 2/3 of the students. School district's done a fabulous job, and so the school district steps in where you might think the churches would, into the lives of the community, and they do a fabulous job. The area is also covered with service agencies, food pantries, resale shops. Most of those are made up of volunteers who come from south of I-10. They're coming across the freeway and serving in the Spring Branch community. But despite all of that, what you'll find is a lack of indigenous leadership in the community. And so you look around and ask, well, who are the community leaders who actually live here? Not the ones who come from across the freeway, but the ones who actually live here, and you'll find that there are very few, if any. The school board, for example, has not had leadership trustees from north of the freeway typically. They've not had Hispanic trustees. Despite that fact, they still do a great job. The city council has never had a Hispanic representative, and so the leadership structure of local people who live here and say this is our community, it simply doesn't exist. And that's the biggest challenge for the future, is how do we develop indigenous leadership, hopefully through the churches, but through any means to be able to develop leaders for this community. Yeah, why is there such a vacuum of leadership here? I think there's a couple of reasons. One is simply the movement of people. The turnover in the schools has reached 40% a year in some years. That means that families are moving, they're on the move, they're looking for better jobs, looking for better places to live. They're not thinking about joining a church, they're not thinking about, gee, maybe I should get on a committee. For example, the schools don't have PTAs north of the freeway, and so there's no leadership structure that they would find themselves falling into. The other reason is more cultural. I think any immigrant population is going to find it very intimidating to try to get into a political structure that they're not familiar with and say, well, I'm going to invest myself in this, and I'm going to become a leader in it. It's foreign to them, and so it's very difficult for an immigrant population, even a second-generation immigrant population, to find their place in a leadership structure and make an investment in the community. There's no encouragement to do so either. And so there's no one here, there's no one in the churches, there's no one in the schools, there's no one in the civic organizations to say, we want local leaders, we want to help develop them, we want them to step up and represent the whole community. There's no real encouragement to that, and so the culture is more of a keep your head down, mind your own business culture, don't make any waves. Underlying all of that is the fear of detention, okay? You may not be here illegally, but you still look like you're here illegally and you can be detained. And getting out of detention, proving your citizenship is a very challenging thing. You'll probably lose your job, And so that contributes to this idea of just keep your head down, mind your own business, and don't make waves. The gentrification of Spring Branch has probably been occurring for about 20 years. It's accelerating. Typically, the gentrification in Spring Branch is going east to west and south to north. And so you can look at the strip of I-10 north to west view, very gentrified, and it's creeping up towards Long Point. Recently, David Weekley bought the flea market on Long Point, which was probably the biggest eyesore in the area, and he already had a housing complex across the street from it. Now he controls the whole property. It's going to be upscale commercial and residential. That's happening all over the area, and developers are finding this is a hot area. It's an area where people who work downtown would like to live. And so developers are naturally reacting to that, and so the gentrification is proceeding at a pretty rapid pace. Again, south to north and east to west. What's interesting, I guess, about that gentrification is that it's occurring while these big, massive apartment complexes still exist. A few have been torn down, but not many. And so their owners, who are typically absentee owners, are finding that these are hugely profitable. They typically keep them for about 7 years. They depreciate them to zero. They flip them to another developer, and the cycle repeats again. And so the gentrification is occurring, but in the midst of the gentrification, there's still poverty. And again, they're literally side by side in places. Long term, those apartment complexes will be torn down. Long term, the displacement that's happened so far will also accelerate, and the low-income people will find some other place to live. They'll be moving out. If there's any way to stop the regentrification, I'm not sure I know what it would be. The developers, Metro National, for example, is the largest landowner in Spring Branch, and they're investing heavily in the area, and they're not investing in low-income housing. And so the people who have the money and the opportunity are investing in the community. It's not all bad, but it does and will result in a lot of displacement. I don't know that I could imagine any opportunity to really stop that, because it's legal. It can happen. It's economic. It's the free market, I guess, operating in a free market way. And so I haven't heard of anyone, for example, who would say, well, I'm interested in developing some low-income housing for the area. That would be refreshing, but I haven't heard that happening. So no, I'm not sure what could be done to even slow down the gentrification, other than if the economy overall were to slow down. I guess that if I had to answer what the major challenges facing Spring Branch, I would say that the number one challenge is leadership. There's certainly the typical challenges of poverty. Healthcare is not so good. Education is very good. Healthcare is not so good. Transportation is a challenge. There's not much bus service in Spring Branch. There's not places to shop for low-income people in Spring Branch. There's kind of a black market for that. But to me, underlying all of that is the weakness in the churches. Churches have no voice here. They're not active here particularly, and the lack of indigenous leadership. If there was a strong network of leaders in the community who lived here, who were going to stay here, that would make a huge difference. And I think that's a generational thing. How do you develop those leaders? It's a generational thing, and you would hope that by the second generation, the third generation, that would begin to develop, and you'd begin to see local leaders rise up. And I would have to say at this point, from my experience, I haven't seen that happen yet, but that's got to be one of our major goals. Yeah, I can talk about the economy a little bit as well. Of course, Houston has no zoning, and so there are a lot of businesses. There are over 5,000 businesses in Spring Branch, some large, some very small. There's no tracking of, well, where do people work? There's no business networking in the area. There's no chamber of commerce for the area. And so it's very difficult to reach into this area and discern what are the trends of employment, what are the trends of business openings. what we see typically in the economy is outside money coming in and developing properties, commercial and residential properties. That creates employment, but there's no movement to employ local. The school district, for example, doesn't have a policy to buy local. The management district doesn't have a policy to buy local. And so, for example, when you see the blue street signs in Spring Branch, they weren't made in Spring Branch, okay? When you see the really attractive markers that you drive by as you drive into Spring Branch, those weren't made in Spring Branch. And so there's no concerted effort to bolster the economy here from the organizations who have the money to do so. And so the economy is just sort of a haphazard bunch of small businesses mostly who have their own customer bases and who, again, mind their own business and don't particularly have much value towards business networking. I guess for me, the saddest thing I have learned about this community is with all of its potential, with the kids coming out of the schools getting a fabulous education, with a community of people who are hardworking, a community of people who are very family oriented. The saddest thing for me is the weakness of the churches. If I could change one thing in this community by snapping my fingers, it would be to overnight create strong churches excuse me, that were civic minded, that were active in outreach, that would reach into this community, have a voice in the community, and make a difference. Without that, without the churches rising up, Spring Branch will always be plagued by this idea of people coming across the freeway, doing all kinds of good, and then going back home to their house in Memorial at night. And so, to me, the pivotal thing in this community is to find a way to give the churches a voice, to make them stronger, to stop the churches from closing, stop the churches from moving out, but to help bring the churches into the mainstream of the community so that that's where the leadership can develop. Without that, these homeowners associations will always have a stronger voice, the super neighborhoods will always have a stronger voice, the real estate developers will always have a stronger voice. The churches should be the voice that speaks for the people, and that's not happening.